For decades, Africa has been told a dangerous lie, that our survival depends on loans designed in foreign offices, that our development must come with conditions written by people who do not live with the consequences. I reject that lie. Every year, billions of dollars leave Africa through debt repayments, profit extraction, and capital flight. Not because Africa is poor, but because African wealth has been disconnected from African development. Our brothers and sisters in the diaspora are not struggling for capital. They are engineers, doctors, investors, builders of entire economies. Yet their wealth strengthens foreign nations while their homeland is told to beg. This is the contradiction we must end. When I speak of a diaspora investment fund, I am not speaking of charity. I am speaking of ownership, of Africans financing African priorities without asking permission. IMF loans do not fail because Africans misuse them. They fail because they are not designed for sovereignty. They come with conditions that weaken our currencies, shrink our industries, and lock future generations into repayment. If African capital is mobilized with discipline, transparency, and purpose, Africa does not need IMF loans. Not today, not tomorrow. This fund is not about replacing one master with another. It is about removing the master entirely. When Africans invest in Africa on African terms, debt loses its power, dependency loses its leverage, and for the first time, development answers to the people, not creditors. This is not an idea for applause, it is a plan for independence. For many years, Africa has been told that loans are the fastest road to development. We are told that without institutions like the IMF, our economies would collapse. But I ask a simple question. If these loans are the solution, why does Africa remain permanently indebted after decades of borrowing? IMF loans do not arrive as neutral support. They arrive with conditions that reshape our economies from the outside. We are instructed to cut public spending, reduce subsidies, weaken state industries, and open markets that are not ready to compete. These decisions are presented as technical, but their impact is deeply political. When a country cuts spending on health, education, or infrastructure to meet loan conditions, the people pay the price. When local industries are exposed to unfair global competition, jobs disappear. And when currencies are devalued under structural adjustment, the cost of living rises overnight while wages remain stagnant. This is how dependency is maintained. IMF loans prioritize repayment above development. They are designed to protect creditors, not African futures. Even when money enters the country, much of it flows straight back out through debt servicing, import dependence, and profit repatriation. Africa does not lack resources. Africa lacks control over capital. Every year, Africa loses tens of billions of dollars through illicit financial flows and capital flight. More money leaves the continent than enters it through aid and loans combined. This reality alone proves that Africa is not poor. Africa is misaligned. The tragedy is that while governments are pressured to borrow, African wealth is growing elsewhere. Our diaspora sends billions in remittances every year, often just to support families and cover basic needs. That money keeps households alive, but it does not build power. Loans keep governments trapped in survival mode. They force leaders to manage crises instead of planning futures. They create fear of default, fear of sanctions, fear of isolation. True sovereignty cannot exist under permanent debt supervision. A nation that cannot choose its economic path is not free, no matter how many flags it flies. This is why I say Africa does not need IMF loans if we reorganize our own capital. The question is not whether alternatives exist. The question is why we have not been bold enough to build them. That is where the Diaspora Investment Fund begins. When people speak about the African diaspora, they usually speak in emotional terms. They talk about history, displacement, and identity. But very few are willing to speak honestly about power, and even fewer are willing to talk about capital. That silence has cost Africa decades. The African diaspora controls enormous financial resources spread across North America, Europe, the Caribbean, and parts of Asia. Africans abroad own businesses, technology firms, farms, real estate, and investment portfolios. They help build foreign economies while Africa is told to rely on loans and aid. This contradiction is not accidental. It is structural. Every year, billions of dollars are sent back to Africa through remittances. These flows keep families alive, pay school fees, and cover medical costs. But remittances are survival money. They are not development capital. They do not build factories, power grids, or transport systems. They do not create economic leverage or long-term sovereignty. A diaspora investment fund changes this structure completely. It transforms scattered individual efforts into collective economic force. This is not emotional fundraising or symbolic solidarity. It is disciplined capital pooling with professional governance, measurable returns, and clear developmental priorities aligned with African needs. For the first time, Africans in the diaspora would be treated as investors, not donors. Their capital would be directed into productive sectors that strengthen local economies and reduce dependence on imports. agriculture that feeds African populations, energy that powers African industry, and infrastructure that connects African markets to each other instead of exporting raw materials outward. Many will say trust is impossible. They will point to corruption and past failures. These concerns are real, and that is exactly why this fund cannot resemble anything that came before. Transparency must be non-negotiable. Oversight must be independent. Projects must be chosen for productivity, not politics. When diaspora capital is mobilized correctly, governments gain breathing space, they gain negotiating power, they gain the ability to say no to loans that undermine sovereignty. This is not about replacing the state, it is about strengthening African states with African capital. When Africans finance their own development, dependency begins to weaken. And once dependency weakens, freedom is no longer theoretical, it becomes practical. The IMF presents itself as a lender of last resort, a stabilizer during crisis, and a guardian of economic discipline. But in practice, IMF loans are designed for systems that already control their capital flows. Africa does not. When countries without financial sovereignty borrow under these conditions, the result is not stability, it is permanent supervision. IMF programs demand policy changes that weaken state capacity at the very moment it should be strengthened. Public spending is cut while populations are growing, local industries are exposed before they are competitive, strategic sectors are privatized under pressure, often sold to foreign interests that extract value without reinvesting locally. These measures may balance spreadsheets, but they hollow out economies. A diaspora investment fund attacks this problem at its root. IMF loans exist because African states lack access to patient, long-term capital that respects sovereignty. When African capital fills that gap, the logic of IMF intervention collapses. There is no reason to accept external conditions when internal financing exists. This fund is not emergency money. It is strategic money. It is invested with long-time horizons and clear developmental goals. Unlike loans, it does not demand austerity in exchange for survival. It demands performance in exchange for partnership. The difference is fundamental. Loans extract, investment builds. Loans discipline governments to satisfy creditors. Investment disciplines projects to deliver results. When capital comes from Africans, accountability shifts toward the people and the future, not foreign institutions. With reliable internal financing, governments can plan beyond crisis cycles. They can invest in food security, energy independence, and industrial capacity without fearing immediate retaliation from global lenders. Currency stability improves because reliance on foreign debt decreases. Trade balances improve as domestic production replaces imports. IMF influence survives on fear. Fear of default, fear of isolation, fear of collapse. A functioning diaspora investment fund removes that fear by offering an alternative that is credible, structured, and African-led. This does not mean IMF loans disappear overnight, but their leverage erodes, their conditions lose force, their role shrinks as African capital grows. When Africa finances its own development, IMF loans stop being unavoidable. They become optional. And when something becomes optional, it loses its power. Every African initiative that speaks of money is immediately met with suspicion. People ask the same question, and they have every right to ask it. How will this be different? How do we prevent corruption, mismanagement, and political capture? If this fund is built like past institutions, it will fail like them. That truth must be stated clearly. A diaspora investment fund cannot be controlled by political personalities, ministries, or election cycles. It must operate with professional management, strict rules, and public accountability. Its credibility will not come from speeches. It will come from structure. First, governance must be independent. The fund must be managed by financial professionals with proven track records, not political appointees. Oversight boards must include diaspora representatives, African development experts, and independent auditors. Decisions must be documented, traceable, and open to scrutiny. Second, transparency must be absolute. Every dollar invested, every project approved, and every return generated must be publicly reported. Technology allows this today. Digital dashboards, public audits, and real-time reporting remove the secrecy that corruption depends on. When citizens and investors can see where money goes, abuse becomes difficult. Third, investment must focus on productive sectors, not prestige projects. This fund is not meant to build monuments or vanity infrastructure. It must prioritize agriculture, energy, logistics, manufacturing, and technology that solves real African problems. Projects must be selected based on economic viability and social impact, not political loyalty. Fourth, returns must matter. Investors must see that their capital grows while Africa develops. This is not charity, it is mutual benefit. When returns are real, discipline follows. When discipline follows, trust grows. Finally, legal protections must be strong. Investments must be shielded from arbitrary seizure, policy reversals, and political interference. Clear contracts and independent arbitration mechanisms are essential to maintain confidence. Corruption thrives in chaos and opacity. This fund must operate in the opposite environment: order, clarity, consequence. If these principles are respected, the Diaspora Investment Fund becomes something Africa has rarely seen: a financial institution that serves development without stealing sovereignty. When Africa is no longer forced to borrow for survival, everything changes. Development stops being reactive and becomes strategic. Governments stop managing crises and start building systems that last beyond one generation. With stable internal financing, food security becomes a priority, not a slogan. African nations can invest in modern agriculture that feeds their people first before exporting surplus. This reduces import dependence, protects currencies, and shields populations from global price shocks that they do not control. Energy follows the same logic. Instead of exporting raw resources and importing finished power solutions, African countries can build regional energy systems that support industry. Reliable power allows manufacturing to grow. Manufacturing creates jobs. Jobs create purchasing power that stays inside African economies. Infrastructure also takes a new direction. Roads, rail, and logistics networks are built to connect African markets to each other. Regional trade strengthens, local businesses scale, economic growth becomes internally driven rather than externally extracted. Without IMF conditions dictating policy, governments regain flexibility. They can protect strategic industries. They can invest in education and health without fearing punishment from lenders. They can pursue industrial policy that reflects national priorities rather than global prescriptions. This shift also changes Africa's position on the world stage. Negotiations become balanced, partnerships replace dependency. When Africa no longer approaches the world as a debtor, it approaches as an equal. Most importantly, young Africans begin to see a future at home. Talent drain slows, innovation increases, confidence replaces resignation, people stop asking how to live and start asking how to build. This is what economic sovereignty looks like in practice. Not isolation, not rejection of the world, but engagement on terms defined by African interests. A diaspora investment fund is not a miracle. It is a tool, but when used correctly, it changes the direction of history. To Africans living outside the continent, I speak to you directly now. Africa does not need your sympathy. It needs your partnership. It needs your discipline, your skills, and your capital aligned with a clear purpose. For too long, the relationship between Africa and its diaspora has been emotional but economically weak. Pride without structure does not build nations. Nostalgia without strategy does not change power relations. What Africa needs now is organized commitment. A diaspora investment fund is not about blind trust. It is about shared responsibility. It is about Africans abroad demanding standards, transparency, and performance because their capital is at stake and their future is connected to the continent, whether they live there or not. You already invest every day. You invest in foreign banks, foreign bonds, foreign pension systems, and foreign stock markets. Those investments strengthen economies that are already powerful. Imagine redirecting a portion of that discipline toward Africa with professional management and real returns. This is not a call to abandon where you live. It is a call to extend your influence, to turn African success abroad into African strength at home. When the diaspora invests collectively, Africa negotiates differently. Governments govern differently. The world listens differently. I am not asking you to rescue Africa. Africa is not broken. I am asking you to help remove the structures that keep Africa dependent. This fund is a declaration that Africans can finance their own development, that Africa's future will not be decided in foreign boardrooms, that loans with conditions will no longer define our path. If we succeed, IMF loans become unnecessary, not because we fought them, but because we outgrew them. History will not remember who gave speeches. It will remember who built systems. Africa stands at a crossroads that generations before us could only imagine. One path continues the cycle of debt, dependency, and decisions made far from our people. The other path demands responsibility, discipline, and courage, but it leads to sovereignty. The choice is no longer theoretical. African wealth already exists. African talent already exists. What has been missing is alignment. When capital, leadership, and purpose move in the same direction, history accelerates. A diaspora investment fund is not an act of defiance. It is an act of maturity. It signals that Africa is ready to finance its priorities, manage its risks, and own its outcomes. This is how nations grow strong, not by borrowing their future, but by investing in it. The era of dependency did not begin by accident, and it will not end by slogans. It ends when Africans decide that no one else will build Africa for us. It ends when we replace emergency thinking with long-term planning. It ends when we stop asking for permission to develop. Africa does not need to isolate itself from the world. It needs to engage the world from a position of strength. Partnerships are welcome. Exploitation is not. If this fund succeeds, it will not just reduce the influence of IMF loans, it will redefine Africa's place in the global economy, not as a debtor, not as a charity case, but as a confident continent shaping its own destiny. That is the future we must choose.